I'd like to bring up Sadiq Jaffer, who's going to have a fireside chat with Sam Roberts, and the title is, Do you need a chief Bitcoin officer adopting Bitcoin within your organization? So guys, please take the stage. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, as mentioned, the chat that Sam and I are going to be having today asks the question, do you need a chief Bitcoin officer? What does that mean when you're adopting Bitcoin inside your organization? So there's two real sections to what we're going to cover today. First of those is the variations of Bitcoin adoption and the various persuasion strategies that you may employ for the people that you engage with. And then ultimately we'll come on to the role of the chief Bitcoin officer and why or if it's actually needed. A little bit about myself. Sadiq Jaffer. I work for KPMG UK. I sit within the technology team, and one of the things I'm looking at the moment is Bitcoin adoption strategies, incorporation of Bitcoin mining into data center design and renewable energy. And we're now looking at how we help organizations adopt Bitcoin as part of their balance sheets. On my left, we have Sam Roberts, who obviously has done some great work in the pension sector with the allocation in the UK. So I'll hand over to Sam to allow him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Sadiq, and good afternoon, everyone. So, I'm a director at Cartwright, and we advise and help implement all kinds of asset strategies for pension schemes, corporates, and charities. And the revolutionary act that we took about 3 years ago was to add Bitcoin to the list of assets that we considered for clients. We've been on a bit of a journey over the past 3 years. It's been a lot of fun. So part of that journey was introducing an allocation, so as Daniel said. It started at 3%. It's not 3% now because it was just over a year ago that they invested. And that's been, we can talk a little bit more about that as we go through maybe. And then the other exciting thing around the corporate treasury side is that, of course, and we'll talk about some of the nuances in this market, but one of the exciting elements is Bitcoin treasury companies, and we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this panel because I think they're going to be talked about a fair amount today and tomorrow. But partly for disclosure and partly because it's directly relevant to this chat. So there is intending to IPO, I think is the wording I need to use, Scott, a Bitcoin treasury company quite shortly, and we're helping out on the exchange and custody side, but also I'll be the non-exec chairman of that company when that happens, when it's intended to happen. So there's a little bit about, and the reason why that's particularly interesting in the context of this chat is that the operating business of Connecting Excellence Group is recruitment. It is executive search. It's finding senior people for senior roles. And what they've done is create a division that focuses on Bitcoin roles for those senior posts, and that flows very nicely into chief Bitcoin officers.
Thank you, Sam. So first of all, congratulations on the intended IPO. Okay. So the first thing that we really wanted to talk about today was looking at variations of organizations. So considering Bitcoin's various applications, we talk about treasury, we talk about payment rails, we talk about collateral. How does those use cases, or how do those use cases differ based on organization's size and the structure when they're looking at integrating these assets?
So that's really what's the landscape that we're talking about
Correct,
here. So maybe it's worth touching on, first of all, you've got different types of institution. I know this day is called Bitcoin Corporate Day, but actually it's broader than that. It's institutions generally, I think, that can take advantage of integrating Bitcoin in some way. So what are the key institutions? We all know them already, but just for the sake of argument. So governments, and there'll be different. You've got central government, which may be quite difficult, particularly in the UK at the moment. But then you've also got local governments, which should be a bit easier. And you've also got sovereign wealth funds all coming in within that category. The next one is corporates. So maybe we can split that into Bitcoin treasury companies. Maybe that forms 1%. But actually, for this particular conversation, it's the other 99% that are particularly interesting, because those are companies that should be adopting Bitcoin in some way. But, well, we'll talk more about how. Then charities, which includes foundations, NGOs, and then lastly, what have I forgotten?
Financial services.
Pension funds in particular. That's right. Yeah, I should remember that one. So pension funds in particular. Now, each of those, Bitcoin's got various different attributes. And so the three key ones are treasury asset, payment rail, and collateral. And not all of those are relevant to everyone, which is why it needs some careful thinking through in each particular situation. For pension schemes, actually, it's really just a store of value one. So they are looking for an asset they can add to a portfolio, that they expect to do well over time, that can boost their Sharpe ratio, all those kind of good things. But that's their key focus. It's probably, in terms of the broad range of ways that Bitcoin can be adopted, and therefore the need for a chief Bitcoin officer, it's really, I think, companies, particularly the 99%, and also charities that could really benefit from that.
Okay, so just to follow up on that, you talk about the landscape of different companies. You mentioned that with the pension funds, that they're obviously focused it from the store of value. What would be the types of companies that would look at it from a collateral point of view? What would be the types of companies that would consider it for payment rails? Does it really vary by sector, in your opinion?
Yes. Next question.
Okay.
No, I'm joking. So the industry sector is going to make a big difference. So everyone here, I imagine, will come from different, or some overlap, but different industry sectors. And so what matters in your particular case for your particular company is going to make, where's the low-hanging fruit? And so for a lot of companies, actually it probably is using Bitcoin as a treasury asset. It's trying to protect against inflation, trying to protect against counterparty risk, of which there normally is quite a lot within, across the economy. But if you're a retailer, actually, that payment rails enabling customers to pay in the local fiat currency or Bitcoin could be an incredibly useful attribute of Bitcoin. There are, you can think about, if we go through some of the collateral, let's talk briefly about that one. So that may be useful for any company if they normally are used to borrowing against their assets to then further supercharge their business, but actually it might be too risky for a lot of people. Where I think it gets particularly interesting is flipping it on its head, and it's not the company itself borrowing against its Bitcoin, it's where it's helping Bitcoin be used as collateral for it lending out. So and this is not easy to do at the moment, I don't think it's possible at the moment, but it will come, is for retail mortgages. At the moment, a mortgage is borrowed against the security of a house, which is idiosyncratic, it's illiquid, you've got to sell all of it or none of it, it's stuck to the ground, you can't move it around. It's not great to lend against. However, if you combine it with part property, part Bitcoin, suddenly it gets a lot more interesting very quickly from a pure lending point of view. It makes it much more attractive, and there's various things that could be done by the banks to help to maybe share some of that Bitcoin upside the longer that mortgage is retained on the book. So you're encouraging good payment behaviour by the person taking the mortgage out.
Yeah, so you touched upon counterparty risk when we were talking about collateral and lending. There's obviously other risks to consider as well when we talk about the organisation's risk tolerance, their appetite, the spectrum that they sit on. Could you just elaborate on some of the risks that organisations may encounter when they go down this route?
Yeah, before you do that, you need to define what risk is relative to. So we are so used to, in our world, thinking of risk as relative to the local fiat currency. So we pay out in, well, in my situation, we pay out in pounds sterling. So our low risk asset is pound sterling. It'd be different if you're in the euro or in America. But is that really your low risk asset? And I think we're in the process of going through a bit of a step change with thinking about what that low risk asset is. So the unquestionable asset, as I heard a few moments ago, I think that's a great way of putting it. What is your unquestionable asset? And that's what your risk is then relative to. So that's a massively involved conversation for a particular company, charity, etc. To work out what that is. What's their starting position? What's their goal? What are they measuring relative to? It's only really once you've done that you can think more deeply about what solutions we're going to put in place to achieve that.
So coming back to your pension fund that you did the 3% allocation to, what was the sort of risk-related conversation that you had there with them? I imagine a sector as conservative as pensions, that was quite a long and convoluted process to talk through all the risk scenarios with them.
Yeah, it was, but it helped that we were just treating it like any other asset. And I think that's a key message for any organisation. It's saying there's lots of things you could use, just add this to the list and then apply your normal analysis, your normal thresholds for what you're comfortable with from a risk point of view. So yes, it was. It wasn't a 5-minute job to have that conversation, but why they were so brilliant was because they were open-minded and they were serious. They took it seriously. And as soon as you start doing that, you realise that actually it's got something to offer. Now, what it's got to offer in a particular circumstance is going to very much depend on the circumstance. In this particular pension scheme situation, they got comfortable that 3% allocation was what was right for them. But it could be very different in another scenario. And of course, they were only looking at it from store value point of view rather than these other attributes.
So just leading into stakeholders and sort of taking them on that persuasion journey, we've obviously touched upon some of the risk-related conversations, some of the allocation-related conversations that you've had. Were they some of the biggest hurdles that you had to get over when you were talking to people about taking this step? How did you sort of approach that conversation where you tried to position Bitcoin as a groundbreaking technology rather than just a speculative asset? What was that journey like for you?
So in some ways, I think it's easier just looking, with the only requirement is the store value aspect of it, and therefore, what's the expected return, what's the volatility, what are the other risks? That's probably an easier conversation than, yeah, but you should let people pay you in Bitcoin. So maybe I got off a little bit lightly there, but I say it just comes back to thinking through from them, just outlining, just being upfront about it, right? So nothing is completely risk-free, and so there are scenarios for a pension scheme where they would need to liquidate all their assets. So if that's in a situation where, well, first of all, you choose the pension scheme where that's highly, highly unlikely, like this one. So you've got a long investment time horizon, so you can ride out that volatility. But yeah, you just put it in the context of and just be upfront about the risks and people go in with open eyes.
And then as you start to think about organisational readiness, you think about organisations that want to take those initial steps, they want to dip their toes in. What was some of the initial steps that you took to open people's minds to Bitcoin? Did you have to run through sort of, start at the very basic beginning? What is Bitcoin? What problem does it solve? Almost take them on that educational journey, right through from some educational work to potentially pilot projects or partnerships. How did you structure that sort of educational journey when you were talking to the pension funds?
So it started with, rather than what is Bitcoin, it started with what is money. And went through the history, went through things that have been money but are no longer. Why is that? And this is something which, I mean, it's never really talked about. Certainly, so I'm an actuary by training, never talked about any of this. And I think that's partly what makes it difficult in my industry, is that I'm surrounded by people that have never thought of this. And that can be quite frustrating if they refuse to think about things differently or think about something else.
Yeah, so is it almost the case that you had to take them on the chapter-by-chapter journey through the Bitcoin Standard Book, pretty much?
It was a bit like that, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure we've all been on that journey ourselves. So coming on to actually thinking about now the Chief Bitcoin Officer, obviously the topic of our talk is, do you need a Chief Bitcoin Officer? But the question is, what does a Chief Bitcoin Officer actually do? So what are the day-to-day responsibilities of a Bitcoin officer? Is it strategic? Is it compliance? Is it technology? Is it all of the above? And then do you think it's actually essential for all organizations?
So this is huge.
Yeah,
right?
it's a massive topic. We could spend half an hour just on this, yeah.
But it's also a huge role, potentially. So the way that I look at it is that a Chief Bitcoin Officer, or whoever's got that dedicated role, whatever their job title is, they should be thinking about everywhere within their business that is touched by money. Now, it's quite a lot. But it's even more than that. So it's all the money coming in. It's what you do with the money whilst you've got it. It's are you borrowing against that money? And then it's all the money flowing out to suppliers. Should you be paying your staff in Bitcoin? It's all those kind of considerations. But it's also in the context of where the vast majority of people don't understand Bitcoin, and that's fine. It's a new technology which is being adopted. And so a big part of that role is around communication and helping to implement what, in some respects, can be quite a technical.
So almost like an evangelist within the company.
Yeah.
So did you almost have to do that within Cartwright before you almost did the pension allocations thing? We talk about the 3% allocation that you did, but did you almost have to take Cartwright on that journey beforehand before you could even get to that point?
There was multiple steps. So yes, you're right. So I had to take Cartwright on that journey first. It therefore helps to be senior within that organisation. Gives you a little bit of, you feel you've at least earned some goodwill. And then there was layers of decision making with the client as well. The way it operates in the UK, you have to. There's a trustee board, independent trustee board that has to make any investment decision, but then they have to speak to the sponsoring employer of that scheme, and maybe there's a parent employer as well. So you've got certain layers to go through. It's not a quick process, but if it's done in the right way, obviously it can be done.
Yeah, and that's coming out from, I'm guessing you're talking about from the compliance point of view, how you approach that. Was there any technical aspects to it as well? Did you have to, was Bitcoin being as such a technical subject as it is, did you have to almost teach people about the technology as you were taking them on this journey?
Yeah, and different layers of that decision making need different information skills, to be able to make that decision and say, okay, or know that someone else has thought about it already. So, but it works, yeah.
So that actually brings us quite neatly into the next subject, which is we talk about the Chief Bitcoin Officer as potentially a dedicated role. But for some organisations, depending on where they are on the size spectrum, where they are on the adoption spectrum, it's not going to make sense to do that. It's going to be a shared role. It could be that it's outsourced to a consulting firm, an advisory firm, someone such as yourself, for example. Or it could be that it actually goes into the remit of an existing member of the C-suite, potentially the CIO, the CTO, the CFO, the CEO. So what's your take on that spectrum of shared versus it being incorporated into a different member of the C-suite? How do you approach that conversation with various clients?
I mean, it's massively organisation specific. whatever the politics are, the history is, for that particular organisation it just sort of almost overwhelms everything else. I mean, I think it's worth noting that for a company, no matter how large, just to go out and hire a chief Bitcoin officer, which by definition we're kind of assuming is sitting on the board, it's a big move. And not that many companies would be comfortable making that bigger move, and this is some very specific reasons for doing so. But equally, it's not, I don't think it's acceptable. I mean, you could argue it's verging on reckless, actually, to just stick your head in the sand and not do anything. So there needs to be some way of dipping a toe in the water, and that could be, I mean, you've mentioned a few things there. It could be any of those. I think one thing that will be quite popular is whether they're possibly hired in to do this, but at a more junior role. So they're a little bit under the radar, or they can be, filtered. Whatever their view is, can be filtered through the CFO or the treasurer before it gets to the board, so they feel that they're in control of what's going on. And so they're relatively senior because they're only one step below. But yeah, they're an easier way to sort of sense check for the company to get comfortable with that position. So I can see that being quite popular.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So there's obviously going to be a big political discussion to be had here when you talk about whether it is a dedicated C role itself or whether it sits under the CIO, the CTO. There's always going to be those conversations, right? Okay, what is the reporting line this should sit under? Whose ownership does it sit within? But also, from my own personal experience, whenever I've been involved in technology integrations into firms, where we've looked at things like cloud, robotic process automation, for example, organizations typically think they can do this, and they just dive straight in, incorporate this new technology, and then all of a sudden, 6 months in, a year in, they find themselves in a massive mess, and then they call people like me to come and try and fix it. So do you think that's likely to be the case as well, where some organizations are going to underestimate the complexity of doing something like this and get themselves into something of a mess as well? Can you see that?
Yeah, I expect that to happen. Yeah,
definitely. Okay. So do you think the Chief Bitcoin Officer will become standard in the way that organizations, pretty much all organizations now have a CIO, a CTO in some capacity? Do you see a future where the Chief Bitcoin Officer is a dedicated member of the C-suite if it's the right organization? Do you see that happening?
Yes, I do. I think it'll take a little bit of time, but we've got a thing going on certainly in the UK, and I think much more wider than that, where there's been career risk. I mean, a huge number of private messages that have said, I'm glad you're talking about Bitcoin, but I'm scared to mention it because I'll get sacked, basically. And that's a terrible situation, and it says a lot about those companies that they are closing down debate, even if it's on something that they feel is a little bit crazy. But at some point, that career risk will flip, and those that can get ahead of it should do very well. And a chief Bitcoin officer may not only be a good way to think through and implement these changes, but also a good thing to say to market, say we are taking this seriously. I agree with Matthias earlier when he said this is more than, the internet is a good analogy when that came in, and maybe in hindsight everyone should have had chief internet officers. But this is bigger than that. Going back to what I said earlier about it's everywhere where money touches your business. That is a lot to think through and a lot to explain to people who are used to one system and helping them to understand another system.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So just coming on to the final topic that we wanted to cover before we open it up to Q&A, assuming we still have time, that is. We've talked about the spectrum of organisations that would maybe want to do this, go down the route of adopting Bitcoin. There's also a spectrum of products to consider as well, ranging from Bitcoin in self-custody, Bitcoin with an enterprise custodian, all the way through to the ETFs. The way I like to think of this is it's something of a matrix, and every organisation will have its own sweet spot. That's obviously going to depend on the analysis you do for that organisation, how they view themselves strategically. But do you see that sweet spot, as I call it, more of a starting point for the journey? And then how does that journey progress as the role of the CBO actually grows within the organisation?
Yeah, you almost need a matrix for how do you most easily dip your toe in the water, and then you need another matrix for X years' time. And how are you going to move from here to there? And there are some decisions that you could take now which, I mean, nothing's completely irreversible, but you may incur unnecessary costs. So by thinking through the journey, and who better to think through a journey than a chief Bitcoin officer?
Yeah, so they own the roadmap of Bitcoin adoption within your organisation, and that's their role. Cool. Do we have time for questions? Yeah, you got 5 minutes. 5 minutes? Okay. Are there any questions in the crowd? Any questions for Sam on anything we've discussed? Okay.
Yeah. Let me just grab a mic and I'll just grab one of these. I actually, thank you. Sam, I'm cheating because I know the answer to this because you came on the podcast, but I think everybody would be interested to know, what did you do about self-custody and educating the pension fund about, the importance of looking after those keys and proof of reserves and everything like that? I think that would be something a chief Bitcoin officer would definitely have to be having a conversation about.
And that's why it needs sort of the special knowledge, the special understanding in these. So for custody, you have here a bearer asset. You have a form of money, and that's why you can hold it in its true form. So thinking through, so if it was a quick trade, yeah, maybe there's an ETF, maybe there's something like that could help. But if it's a very long-term holding, you want to remove as many risks as possible, and that's the way that we came at it for the pension scheme, and indeed for other clients as well. So it's trying to minimise the risks you don't need to take. So having on-chain Bitcoin, having a segregated wallet, having bankruptcy remote a situation from the custodian. It's all these things that you think through. And it reminds me actually that we went into a huge amount of detail, okay, partly because it was the first, but we went into a huge amount of detail on the research for how we were going to hold Bitcoin. And then we started looking at it. I had to stop myself thinking about it because it'd be too risky. But then we started saying, well, hang on, if we applied the same principles to all the other assets that are held, would they actually pass the bar? And maybe in some cases, maybe not others. But I think it was a higher bar, much higher bar that we applied to holding Bitcoin than to any other asset, and made it an extra interesting process to go through.
What did you settle on? What can you share with us?
I'm not going to share everything.
There's a question here.
So what kind of, I could imagine you might have had a struggle with like metrics and optics. Like how do you even think about expressing what's going on with Bitcoin when it's just one line item with all the other assets, but it's managing a different risk?
Yeah, so one of the risks that we specifically talked about was the monetary premium risk, and so other assets being used as savings account rather than for their utility, and how that monetary premium could flow, and if so, what's your hedge against that monetary premium flowing out of equities and out of property, and then you buy the asset that should benefit from that situation. That is your hedge. So there's certain scenarios where it all goes back to what I was saying earlier about what is your low-risk asset. Well, actually, in some scenarios, Bitcoin is your low-risk asset. Was there a second part to that?
No. Thanks.
Was there one more? There was one more just there. Yep.
Hi, Sam. Hi, Sadiq. Great fireside, by the way. Kind of curious, on the chief Bitcoin officer perspective, if you had to kind of put on your predictive hat, right? We do see this role kind of emerging amongst Bitcoin treasury companies, companies where they're already in this space, but if you had to kind of guess one or two companies that are kind of household names out for people outside of this room to be the first one to adopt such a role as a Bitcoin officer, chief Bitcoin officer, what are some of those ideas that might come off the top of your head, and maybe why those companies? Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm going to go for type of company rather than specific names. I think, look at those companies that are most likely to struggle in the years ahead, or could particularly benefit. So, for example, luxury goods firms. They're really used as a form of savings, actually. There's a I want to be flashy. I want to show off. I don't have a Lamborghini, but if someone who does, presumably that's part of the logic that they want to show off, and that's fine. That will stay. But to the extent they've got a classic car and it's just stuck in the garage. So I think those firms. I think where else is there a huge amount of financial pressure? Local government. I think there's a huge amount. The prospect for bit bonds or Bitcoin embedded bonds within the debt that they issue is absolutely huge, and we are crying out for it in the UK. And I'm crying out to them to say, look, you really need to have a conversation with you're running a deficit, and this will put you back in balance. Just on the interest you would save. So think of any company that's under financial pressure, I think, because then there's a real motivation for them to act.
And just to add to that, from my point of view, I think the CBO role, coming at it from the technology point of view, it's going to be how deeply they embed the technology into their organisation. So if you have an organisation, let's say in the renewable energy sector, where they want to integrate Bitcoin mining, they're going to have a CBO within their organisation. If you've got a company which is a fintech that's taking Bitcoin payments, they are going to have a CBO. If you are a Lightning liquidity provider, they are going to have a CBO. And then what I think will happen is, depending on if at one end of the spectrum, as Sam described, or at the other end of the spectrum I'm talking about, the reporting structure of the CBO will be different. In the scenario that I've described, it's going to be more towards the technology end, where it could be the CBO or head of Bitcoin strategy sits underneath the CTO, whereas with what Sam was talking about, it could be that reporting line sits under the CEO or CFO. And that, I think, is going to vary across that spectrum.
And heads up, we're going to talk more about energy at the end of tomorrow.
And if you have any questions about anything we've just spoken about, please feel free to approach us later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well done, mate.